All right, we have finally reached the modern period. Probably thought we were never going to get here. So in the modern period, we don't really have a fancy name for it yet, as we've said, because we're just not far enough removed from it to do so. And we also have so much variety in the modern period that I don't know how we're going to come up with a name for it. Anyway, maybe we're just going to call this the eclectic period or something as time goes by. So what's happening in the style of music in this period? A lot of different things. In fact, probably every 10 years, something new and creative comes along in terms of what we're doing with the music. So we can't really give a general view, but we'll just talk about some trends that are sort of happening in the modern period. Particularly at the beginning of the period, remember we're coming out of the Romantic where everything was very emotional, very singable, lyrical, that sort of thing. The swing away from that we see is that we really become focused on rhythm rather than melody. So the rhythmic force is what really drives a lot of modern music, and that's true of even popular music. You know, it's all about the driving beat behind it. So very intense rhythms in many cases, a lot of very complicated rhythms. We have a lot more influence now from various different cultures, and for example, in Africa, it's very typical in an ensemble to have 4 or 5 different sort of competing rhythms happening simultaneously. So we see that coming into art music, where composers will take things that before we would have thought, oh, geez, those don't go together. Let's put them together and see what happens. And so we do that. So rhythm is much more important than melody. Now, that doesn't mean composers stop writing pretty melodies and sing things that are singable. But they're experimenting. They want to do something different than what's always been done. So you'll see more of the other, but you'll also hear lots of things that you'll think, oh, I like that a lot. It's not jarring my nerves or anything, or whatever your reaction happens to be to things that are a little bit off kilter. So because rhythm is so important, that means percussion becomes a lot more important. Up to this point, the string family has sort of been the driving force for instrumental music, and everybody else was a supporting player. When you get to the modern period, the strings sort of take the back seat, and winds and percussion become the stars. So you'll hear a lot more music where the woodwinds and the brass are taking over the melodic parts and the big, powerful bits, and a lot more use of percussion. You know, if you go to a concert and you hear a Mozart symphony, the only percussionist you might see would be a timpani player. But if you go and you hear, for example, a Shostakovich symphony, you're probably going to have a whole array of percussionists in the back playing all sorts of different instruments and really giving a whole new sort of body to the piece of music. So that emphasis on percussion and the winds over strings is fairly typical throughout this period. So we're looking at instruments now that are not necessarily known for being the melodic carriers. You know, we think strings as being the sort of carrying instruments for melody up to this point. So composers really aren't interested much anymore in making the melody something you might want to sing. Remember, that was our romantic ideal, a singable sort of melody. In the modern period, we're going to see much more disjunct movement and much more dissonance. We want a more raw kind of emotion, I think, would be a way to approach that. It's not that the music's not emotional, it's more visceral. So lots of things jumping around. And even vocal music is like that. So even a piece that's written for a singer might not be what we would consider to be singable. In fact, some of the music that we will listen to, it's not even anything that sounds like singing. It's a whole new technique for singing that they've chosen to use. So the focus is on the rhythm over the melody. The melody is whatever it happens to be. It might be beautiful and singable, but chances are it might not be as well. So one of the things about dissonance in this period of time, remember, that sounds that clash or that seem to be in conflict, because we like tension and resolution in music. So we create that tension with dissonance. If you lived in, say, the year 1400, and you heard the interval of a third, which is the basic da-da-da, you might, in that period of time, say, oh, that's very dissonant. Because in that period of time, the intervals that were considered to be not dissonant were very few. There were like 3. and everything else was considered to be not so good. And some of them were even considered to be practically demonic. That interval's so bad, you should never use it. You get to the modern period, and anything goes. Now, if you think about the music that you listen to on a daily basis, you probably rarely hear any sort of note combination that makes you go, ooh, that's painful. But that's because we've heard so many different kinds of combinations over time that we're just used to it. If you played that same piece of music for somebody living in 1600, they would probably run screaming that was just way too much tension and too much dissonance. I can't take it. So our perception of dissonance has changed over time. We're much more accepting of conflicting sorts of pitches. And as we get used to music from cultures where they don't use the 12-tone system, where they have maybe 24 tones in a scale and things are much closer together, there's a whole lot more possibilities for dissonance. So we're more tolerant of those sorts of sounds now, and composers take advantage of that. But that also means they have to work harder to create a sense of tension for us, because we're used to so many things that they have to really work hard to create something that catches our attention. So we'll see composers do things like take your whole arm and slam it down on all the notes on the piano, like crush them. Now that creates some dissonance, because now you've got 10 or 15 notes, however many your arms can cover, making a sound like that. So composers will do things like that to create that tension that we couldn't get now because we're so used to some of the sounds that we're making. So we have these kind of creative uses of new kinds of chords. We also see that composers are moving well beyond the triad that we've been dealing with for the last 400 years. And even the seventh chord, which we sort of add in later, where you add one more note, and we will have chords with ninths and 11ths and 13ths and 15ths. So you have these big extended chords, that's what we call them, that really blur where the tonality is, because now we've got all these extra notes, and every note has a place that it wants to go, which may not be the place that original triad would have been. So composers can stretch out a chord over many more notes and give themselves many more opportunities about the way that they want to go. Sort of like having a 5-way intersection. You have lots of routes. So pick which one you want to go, or maybe I'll take you somewhere that you didn't expect to go at all. So the whole idea of stretching the chordal structure. We'll see new kinds of chords. So instead of being built on thirds, as we did when we looked at that earlier, they might be built on fourths, which gives a very different kind of sound. You can take your virtual keyboard website and you could practice that. Just pick every fourth note and build yourself a chord and see what kind of sounds you get out of that. We also see attempts to not be in any key whatsoever. Atonal music is what we would call that. It has no sense of key. So composers did a lot of different things to try to create that. Most of it you don't hear very much because our brains want organization. And in fact, atonal music is highly organized, because the only way you can create that sense of not being in a key is to work really hard to make it not be in a key. And so they would develop these elaborate systems for how to do that. They're very systematic. If you could just sit down with a piece of paper, you could say, oh yeah, I could see how that happens. But as a listener, you want it to go somewhere. And the randomness that they have to create to make it atonal is sometimes difficult for our ears to deal with, because we want to make it fit into something. We like to make things fit into patterns. So you don't hear much of that performed, but it's interesting to know about it and to know that composers did try to do that. They tried to get where you couldn't predict what was coming next in terms of the key. On the other hand, sometimes they would try to do more than one key at the same time. So you would have two pieces of music, and not two pieces of music, one piece of music, but in two different keys at the same time, which we call polytonality or many keys. So we have, on the one hand, no key at all. On the other hand, more than one key. Either way, the listener can be a little bit confused. We also see that composers in this period of time sort of have a throwback, kind of a retro moment, we'll call it, where they go back to before the time that we used major and minor keys. They go back to those modes that we haven't really looked at much since the Renaissance. It's an old sound that they can make new. We also see composers using scale patterns from different cultures. In Asia, the pentatonic scale, or the 5-tone scale, is very popular. You'll hear that a lot. As we saw in the Impressionist period, we have whole tone scales where everything is by a whole steps and there are no half steps at all. We might have chromatic scales where we use all 12 notes of the scale. So it gives the composer, as we'll call them like a painter, gives them more colors to use within their palette. So they can not have to stick to our old 1, 4, 5 chords. We can go anywhere if we've got 12 tones to work from. We see a lot of use of old instruments in new ways here. Just as we've taken those old scales and using them in modern context, composers wanted to take instruments that have been around for hundreds of years and find new ways to use them. So you'll see things like violinists being asked to turn the bow upside down and play with the wooden side instead of the side with the hair on it. Or you might hear people doing kind of things into flutes, where you don't really get a whole sense of pitch, but you'll get some because the keys are pushed down and you get sort of a sound, but it's not what you would think of as a flute sound. Or you might have, like on French horn, you see a lot more stopped horn and those kinds of effects that we can do. Just taking old things, using them in new kinds of ways. And we'll see that as we look at different pieces from this period of time where composers have done what we would think of as sort of odd things, and you wonder why they decided that would be something to do with an instrument. But that's one of the things that we do. We also have lots of new instruments, but they're not what musicians traditionally would think of as an instrument, and that is everything that we can do electronically. And the synthesizer is new in the modern period. It can reproduce sounds. So you can play in a violin sound, record it into your synthesizer, and then you can play violin sounds forever. The technology for that gets better all the time. It used to be that you could really tell when it was synthesized because it was just the sound and there was no real start of the sound, because part of what our brain processes in terms of how we know that sound is a clarinet versus a flute has to do with the initiation of the pitch, how the pitch starts. And with those early synthesizers, you really couldn't get that start sound. But the modern ones, you can create that. You can get that, how the pitch starts, how the pitch ends. So it's becoming more difficult to tell the difference, although if you go to a live concert, you will definitely feel the difference because there's the acoustic phenomena that's generated when you have 60 people sending vibrations through the air is very different than if you had a synthesizer doing it. But composers, they now have this whole new thing they can use. They can compose on their computer at home. They don't even have to have musicians to play what they've created. They can hear what it's supposed to sound like. We also see them using technology to manipulate music. Think about the early days of the 20th century when we had things like reel-to-reel tape and cassettes. Composers might record a piece of music on a tape, and then they could go back and they could run the tape through the player backward and reverse it, or they could cut it up and snip it and make different, put it together in new kinds of ways. So they would take what was then modern technology and use it to do something different with the music. There are a lot of pieces that were written, say, in the 50s and 60s for an instrument or a singer plus recording, plus electronic tape, where they would have something playing on the tape and the performer had to perform with that. That was their accompaniment. So we see a lot of things like that. We have a lot of new technology. Obviously, the ways that we get music has greatly increased even in the last 20 years. We have, all our devices, every device we have, we can play music on pretty much. Composers are doing things with that. And there are people who compose for cell phones. So lots of variety, lots of different things. But basically, if it sounds like somebody's not done it before, it's probably from the modern period. So now let's take a look at a few pieces from this period to give us an idea about the range of things composers have done in the last 100 years.